So as you may have guessed, the focus this week is going to be asymmetrical framing. So what are some characteristics of this framing style? It's a type of composition in which the visual weight of the elements is distributed unevenly. It creates more diversity in how the image can potentially be composed. In terms of what effect it has, it creates a little bit more tension maybe and a little bit more visual interest in the composition. It can be used, and I think it will be clearer when I show you some examples in illustration specifically. It can be used very effectively to highlight one feature, one particular feature or character in an image. I think even more than the classical balanced composition, I think that cropping, which is the way that you cut an image, which we also talked about a little bit last week, and I think also like the angle of the camera in this case can play quite an important role in this type of composition. I think more important than for what we did for week one. These type of images can give us a sort of sense of movement, and they can also, more or less, as I've already said, asymmetrical compositions feel more dynamic. They feel less controlled than a classical or balanced composition because they don't have this feeling of sort of like everything being completely even and ordered and carefully composed. They definitely offer some more options in terms of how you can put a composition together. There's a little bit more freedom in terms of what you can do with them because in essence you're kind of breaking these rules and you're not so constrained by them anymore. As I've also more or less already said, they give a more spontaneous feeling and they also give maybe a more realistic feeling. And the thing to keep in mind when you're trying to make something that's asymmetrical, or in our case, we're going to initially photograph things that need to be asymmetrical, you need to think about what different visual weights there are in what you're looking at, and they need to be unevenly distributed. By this I mean there might be something that is sort of like a dark, large object that takes up more of the composition than something smaller and lighter, for example. By coincidence, I found another photo by Cartier-Bresson that is actually, I'm sure you will remember the previous image with the cyclist and the stair railings. Something very similar here. Actually, it seems that he enjoyed using these particular things to sort of create some tension in his compositions. This one is very interesting because it's a good example of what I was talking about with this idea of not having proper balance between all of the elements. So I think that in some ways there is a certain regularity to this that's given by the kind of shape of the fence and so on. However, then the fence goes up towards us in one corner and then it's not continued on the right-hand side of the image in the top right corner. We have a building there instead, and then the building also doesn't follow the same line as the fence. So this also, again, creates this feeling of things not being balanced and things not being even. Another thing that is interesting is the fact that most of the figures in the image are actually on the right-hand side, apart from the woman in the bottom left who's cropped a little bit. So again, and some of the images have this quite a lot of dark tone in them. And so immediately there's a difference between the right-hand side and the left-hand side. So there is none of this sort of symmetry that we had with the classical composition previously. And the other thing I want to draw your attention to is the cropping, because I mentioned that already, and this is also a really good example of it, that he hasn't tried to frame this woman in the bottom carefully and perfectly. He has just basically trimmed the image at the bottom with the way that he took the photo. This is something that's very specific to photography. And quite often, I think when we tend to draw images as illustrators, because we have total freedom, if we're drawing something from our heads, for example, we can place the figures however we want. But I think it's interesting to keep this idea in mind that with the advent of photography, it really changed the way that artists painted. And if you look at artists, for example, like Toulouse-Lautrec, he was very influenced by photography and this idea of the way that a camera naturally crops or cuts particular figures on the edge of the picture. And so this is something that never used to exist in painting or in art, in fine art anyway, until photography was invented and artists were able to sort of see these interesting things or specific stylistic aspects of photography that inspired them in terms of wanting to create paintings or images that were a bit more spontaneous and felt a little bit more like in the moment. I also thought that I would show you an example from film, like I was doing last week as well. So you often see this type of interesting asymmetrical, unbalanced composition in films where the director or the cinematographer wanted to give a feeling of things being kind of a little bit unsettling or a little bit strange or unusual. In some cases, when things are meant to feel quite scary or creepy. So this is a still, meaning like, it's just one frame from a German expressionist film that's by Robert Wiener, which is The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. I think it was made around the 1920s. But I just want to draw your attention to the composition and the fact that the character is coming down from the top of the composition, and we definitely have a feeling of disbalance. And this is a good example also of an asymmetrical composition. I thought maybe it's interesting to directly sort of compare it to some illustrations. So this is Brecht Evan on the right. And I think, maybe you can see some of the visual similarities. That the Brecht Evans picture is maybe a little bit more precise and a little bit more organized. It has straight lines, whereas this other one has these weird, creepy kind of nothing is straight and everything's curvy and sort of twisted. But in principle, the idea, at least as far as I see it, is fairly similar. I just wanted to also show you guys an example of cropping, and this is quite interesting. If you know the film director Stanley Kubrick, before he was a film director, he was a photographer, and I think it really is something that taught him. I don't know if anybody is familiar with his films, but his cinematography is just absolutely astounding. And I think, this experience with personally having taken photos himself really assisted him with that. So this is an image that I feel is quite humorous, and the cropping technique is very interesting, where he's actually like cropped the top of the woman's head. So he hasn't even bothered to like keep her in the composition, and all the focus is on the dogs. And I just thought it's a good example to show everyone, to say that, you don't need to be too shy in terms of thinking about doing some interesting cropping. It can sometimes also, when it's applied to illustration, can also really enhance the storytelling. And the other thing it can do is, if we cut something out of the frame, then it also gives a greater sort of sense of mystery sometimes, where you don't show all of a particular scene, or you don't show all of a particular character. Just another picture I thought that I would show you, just in terms of what something with asymmetrical composition might look like if it was just a landscape with no human figures. So this is Antoine McMullen. I think it's pretty self-explanatory, this one. Just, obviously the amount of space that's taken up by the end of the tunnel is disproportionate, and the foreground with the interior of the tunnel is much, much larger than the background. And then there's also a technique that's being used here that I want to talk about in a little bit more detail as well, which is something called a Dutch tilt. Actually, people think that this was called a Deutsch tilt, like German tilt, because it was basically something that became really popular with German expressionist film, which was around in the early part of the 20th century. It was also used in film noir, so these kind of like dark detective films that have a certain like air of mystery, and also kind of they tend to have a kind of like unnerving, kind of scary feeling to them. And the idea of this Dutch tilt is just that the camera tends to not be flat. It's not held evenly, but it rather the camera is actually tilted, so you get a very kind of bizarre, kind of uneasy feeling when you look at it. And it's kind of designed to be like this because it was used specifically for German expressionist films and these film noir films. And so often the cinematographer wanted to make the viewers feel this sense of something not being right, or something being a little bit strange or creepy. It's also just a suggestion for people, when you're taking your photos, maybe you want to experiment with this kind of Dutch tilt system. It definitely can add some interest and some kind of unexpected effects. And I also want to show you, of course, some illustration examples with this asymmetrical compositions or asymmetrical framing technique. This illustration is by Lisk Fang. I think it's a really good example of this idea. Obviously, the focal point is this character that's in the swimming pool, and we are sort of given this extra help in understanding that they're the focal point because of the light coming up from the house, and all of it is, put down in the bottom left corner. And I think it's very easy to understand how this one works. It just is a little bit unexpected, and just gives it a little bit more of a mysterious feeling, and maybe a slight feeling of uneasiness, but it just gives us a different feeling to how it would have if the composition had been very even and balanced. I also want to show you this example by Viola Nicolai. I think it just also demonstrates that this idea of having an asymmetrical composition can be very subtle or slight, because the asymmetry in this is not significant, and the character's face has obviously been framed there with the tennis racket, which is not exactly centered, but it's not very far from the center. So it just gives the image a little bit more interest and a little bit more vitality, and makes it a little bit more lively in some cases. Sometimes this very balanced classical composition that's even everywhere can look a little bit dull. One more example. This is by All Things Bright and Beautiful. I really like the idea of, obviously having these kind of frames that are created by elements in the space, and I think this is a really good example of this. And I would say that maybe if we look at how all the elements in the image have been distributed, we could almost argue that they end up balancing each other out, and that the image is balanced. But I also think that the placement of this vase in the display case, that means that it's slightly off-center, is also a very interesting technique, and just again gives us this feeling of things being a little bit more lively and a little bit more spontaneous. So it's another example of this idea that the asymmetry in the picture that you have doesn't need to be incredibly dramatic in order to be effective. So let's get into the practical part of this week. This time I would like us all to visit a shopping mall. This is the one that I went to, and I don't actually go to shopping malls very often, and I was honestly quite impressed by all the visual possibilities there.
And some observations I can make about my experience there is definitely like this ability to employ the aerial views was very useful and really resulted in what I would consider to be quite nice photos. The other thing that I really appreciated about a shopping mall space is that it has a lot of mirrors. And this also gives you a lot of additional options. For example, you can shoot yourself in the mirror, you can accidentally get little spy photos of people who are standing behind you. And I would really just encourage people to make sure you have at least an hour to do this task, because you need to actually walk around and look at what some of the decor might be able to be used for. I promise that you will get much better, more innovative photos if you actually have the time to walk around the whole space and really investigate angles, proportions, foreground and background, and so on.
After you have collected all of your photos together and downloaded them and so on, then you have to go through basically the same process as last time, which is analysis, which you can do with text, and you can also, as I said, mark up the photos either digitally, which I've done this time, or you can do it with printouts as well. Just try and think very carefully about, if you have a series of photos of the same scene, which one is stronger, and think about why. Or if you have similar length photos, like similar distance, or try and see how you can get some variation between them by cropping some of them just using lines, and see if it makes a difference to how you feel the image looks. There's definitely a lot that you can do just at this stage to improve the composition. You have a lot of freedom actually after you take the photos to make some adjustments, and you obviously need a little bit of time to think over these things, and it's not always possible when you're in the middle of taking the photos. You can also see with some of the analysis I've done of my photos, I've drawn in some areas that I feel would be better adjusted before I make the actual sketch. So it's possible to do that just right on top of the photos. Or in some cases, I don't know if it's clear here, but you can see that I made a decision to basically merge some elements from two photos of the same scene together, just because there were stronger elements in both photos, and it was the most logical decision to actually just take one photo sort of as the background, but sort of mix and match a little bit with some of the elements. So this process is actually really important, and please pay attention to it. And then beyond that, you need to do exactly the same thing as last week. So you need to draw the thumbnails, and then after you have the thumbnails and you have selected which sketch you think is strongest, then you need to, as before, turn your sketch into a fully finished illustration. So I am very interested to see what you do, especially with this week's task. Kind of exciting and kind of challenging. And I'm looking forward to seeing your results. Ciao!